Summit Ridge, Colorado, January 17th, 2:14 a.m. The once-in-50-years blizzard did not arrive with drama. It arrived with weight, silent, relentless weight pressing down on every cabin roof in that narrow valley, turning powder into stone-hard slabs. The wind had dropped hours ago. What replaced it was worse, cracking timbers, short, violent pops in the dark that made people sit up in bed before they even knew why. Then the first siren wailed down Main Street, blue strobes flashing against snow-caked walls and drifting through the whiteout like distant lightning. On Aspen Lane, neighbors were already out in their boots and parkas, headlamps cutting shaky tunnels through the falling snow. They stared up at roofs that looked wrong, eaves bowed, gutters buried, rafters inside their living rooms giving off a slow, sick groan every time another dense layer settled from the sky. At the end of the cul-de-sac stood the cabin everyone had laughed at in the summer, the one with the bunker roof, the one the building inspector called excessive. Daniel Hart's place. When he built it, he doubled up rafters, tightened spacing, and laid a roof deck that looked more like a bridge than a house. Way too heavy, his neighbors said, leaning on fence posts in the mild autumn sun. You building a cabin or a tank, Dan? One of them joked. Another shook his head. Waste of money. Winters aren't like they used to be. Now, let's see what Jacob built, translated into the modern mountains. Because on this night, with wet snow pressing past 50 pounds per square foot, that waste was being tested in real time. Inside Daniel's living room, the world was muffled. No sirens, no shouting, just the soft, rhythmic thud of snow sliding in sheets down the steep metal roof, then settling again as drifting filled the gaps. The walls hummed with quiet heater fans. The lights burned steady. Next door, the power flickered, then cut. You could hear rafters complain through the shared party wall, a long, shuddering creak followed by the sharp crack of a nail letting go somewhere in the dark. Daniel's family had already pulled mattresses into the center of the house, away from exterior walls, away from glass. They sat in a tight circle, listening to the emergency radio. Report of a collapsed garage on Pine. Repeat. Full collapse under snow load. Fire is en route. We have a partial roof failure at the grocery on Main. Occupants evacuated. The list grew. Porches sheared off. A flat-roofed workshop behind the hardware store, pancaked under what the announcer called extraordinary compacted accumulation. You could hear the disbelief in his voice. This was the winter everyone said didn't happen anymore. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, years earlier when he drew those overbuilt plans at his kitchen table that the rest of town chose to ignore? Where neighbors heard overkill, he heard the difference between survival and catastrophe. Cut back outside. Emergency crews in parkas and hard hats taped off a cafe whose ceiling had sagged into a shallow bowl, acoustic tiles stained and bulging like a waterlogged drum. 2 houses down, a family stood in their driveway, staring up at a living room ceiling that had dropped 3 inches overnight. You could see the nail pops in the drywall like a line of tiny white blisters. Then the camera finds Daniel's roof. It is buried. 4, maybe 5 feet of dense wind-packed snow from ridge to eave, the surface glazed and rippled by gusts. It looks impossible, like someone parked a white pickup truck on every 10 feet of that ridgeline. The overbuilt eaves cast a clean, unwavering shadow on the drifts below. No sag, no bow, no visible strain. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century says that when design meets reality, reality always wins. Here, reality had just handed the town its harshest winter exam in living memory. Before we reveal the exact technique that kept Daniel's roof unmoving while normal roofs failed all around him, you have to ask yourself, was this really overkill, or was everyone else underbuilt? So pause for a second and look up at your own ceiling, your own roofline in your mind. What do you think is actually holding that roof up right now? Is it the bare legal minimum in the code book? The habits of whatever contractor happened to win the bid, or a real understanding of how much snow, ice, and drifting weight that structure might face in the worst winter of your life? Most people never ask. They assume that if a building inspector signed a form, the cabin is safe. This was normal. This was mountain town life, but Daniel had watched the winters change in these mountains. He'd seen early season storms dump wet, compacted snow that weighed more than 30 pounds per square foot, and he'd read about rare events pushing loads past 60. He knew that a pretty pitch and a metal roof didn't magically erase physics. He was not an engineer on paper. No license, no letters after his name, just a stubborn, research-obsessed homeowner who lived high in the mountains and refused to trust average numbers when the weather was clearly abandoning average. While his neighbors joked that he was building a bunker instead of a house, he was quietly digging through structural tables, snow load maps, and failure reports. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the others didn't? Not just that snow is heavy, but how that weight actually travels through a roof. From the snowpack into the sheathing, into rafters or trusses, down into bearing walls, and finally into the foundation. He pictured not the postcard cabin his neighbors admired, but the moment when 3 feet of wet snow slid and drifted into a 4-foot deep pocket on one side, twisting the whole roof like a loaded spring. Here's the overlooked angle Daniel fixated on. Building codes in his region were written around a designed snow load, a number pulled from historical records that says, in effect, this should be enough for the storms we expect every 50 years. Those numbers were carved into tables, adopted into ordinances, treated as gospel, but they were, at their core, bets on the past repeating itself. Quietly, those bets were failing. He dug up case studies of low-pitch roofs that met code and still pancaked in once-in-a-generation blizzards. He saw how steeper roofs shed snow, yet drifting around valleys, dormers, and parapets could create local loads far beyond the neat uniform assumptions in the handbook. The difference between survival and catastrophe, he realized, lived in those ugly, uneven piles the drawings never show. Before we reveal the exact technique Daniel used, the rafter spacing, the connectors, the way he tied his heavy roof into the walls, you need a framework. Now, let's see what Jacob built in 1876 as a mental model. A cabin where extra mass and smarter geometry turned cold into stored heat. Daniel was chasing the same kind of advantage, but with snow instead of stone. By the end of this video, you'll know the real numbers behind snow loads, the specific overbuild choices he made, and how to read your own roof. You'll be able to tell whether your home lives closer to Daniel's design or to the ones that failed when winter stopped playing by the old rules. So rewind the tape. Before the drifts, before the headlines, before anyone called it a miracle cabin, it was just one more build going up in a small mountain town that prided itself on doing things the way Granddad did. Late summer in a valley pinned between dark fir ridges and snow-scarred peaks. Dust on the main road, the smell of cut pine, pickup trucks idling by the hardware store. Here, people don't just know how you built your roof. They watched it happen. From porch railings, from tailgates, leaning on fence posts with coffee that somehow never gets cold. This town had a rule. Even if nobody wrote it down, we've always built it this way. Standard trusses. Code minimum snow load. A roof pitch that sheds just fine, thanks. You didn't argue with the pattern. You copied it. Because in the mountains, if most cabins are still standing, that feels like proof enough, doesn't it? Then, Daniel's framing started to rise, and the pattern broke. The first thing the neighbors noticed wasn't the cabin walls. It was the rafters. Too deep, too close together. The skeleton of the roof looked heavy, almost industrial, like it belonged on a ski area maintenance shop, not a family home. Now, let's see what Jacob built, you might be thinking. But this isn't 1876, and there's no stone wall this time. There's engineered lumber, hurricane ties, and a roof pitch that looked, to some eyes, almost ridiculous. Steep enough that from the road, his place looked less like a cozy cabin and more like a wooden wedge driven into the hillside. From his front porch across the lane, Earl McKinley, retired building inspector, watched with narrowed eyes. You know code here's already conservative, right? He called out one afternoon. You're paying for weight you'll never need. In a town where winter could break trees in half, that line still got nods. Next came Mike Alvarez, local contractor, 20 years of roofs behind him. He squinted up at the rafters, then at Daniel. You building a tank or a house? He laughed. That thing could hold a parking lot. The other men in the pickup with him laughed too. Not cruel, just confident. Social proof on four wheels. Even old-timer carpenter Ruth Jensen, who had seen more winters than most of them combined, shook her head. "You don't need a bunker roof, kid," she said, tapping one of his oversized beams. "Snow here's heavy, sure, but we've been fine with less since before your parents were born." Her message was the same. You're overdoing it. You're wasting money. The code is enough. Here's where the pressure starts to bite. It's one thing to run the numbers on snow loads, 20, 30, even 60 pounds per square foot in a freak winter, and see that the math works. It's another thing to stand in the yard while every person you respect tells you that you're paranoid. For most people, the chorus of neighbors is louder than any calculator. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? Before we reveal the exact technique, sit with the moment he almost backed down. Late evening, the site quiet, the mountains already throwing long, cold shadows across the valley. Daniel walked the length of the ridge, hand tracing along an oversized beam. He paused at each connection, each bracket, silently rerunning the calculations that had kept him up at night. Snow density, drift zones, roof pitch, code tables that assumed a past climate, not a future one. He could hear the echoes of their voices, bunker, tank, waste hanging in the cooling air. Then he looked up at the jagged skyline and thought about winters getting stranger, storms getting heavier, about the thin line between overkill and the difference between survival and catastrophe. He took his hand off the beam, nodded once to no one, and decided to ignore the laughter. Because he was betting on something the town didn't want to think about yet. A bet that would be tested, brutally, when the snow stopped falling like it used to. To understand what he was betting on, you have to understand what snow really is to a roof. Not poetry. Not a pretty winter blanket. Weight. Cold, relentless weight pressing down on every square foot of that cabin. Pounds per square foot sounds abstract until you picture it. Imagine you and a line of your neighbors, shoulder to shoulder, standing across his roof. Each of you weighs, say, 180 pounds. If you're standing on a patch of roof that's 3 feet by 3 feet, that's 9 square feet carrying 180 pounds, about 20 pounds per square foot. That's how engineers see winter, not as flakes, but as people standing on the roof, refusing to get off. Light, fluffy powder is the easy kind. The postcard snow. It might be only 5 to 7 pounds per square foot, like a few kids scattered across the rafters. You can sweep it with a broom, watch it slide off a steep pitch, feel smug about how it always melts in a day or two. But when the temperature hovers near freezing, when the snow gets wet and compacted, the numbers change fast. Heavy, saturated snow can jump to 20, 30, even 40 pounds per square foot. In rare events, with rain on snow, it can push past 60. Now you don't have kids on the roof. You have a parking lot, and it doesn't land evenly. Wind scours one side of a roof and dumps drifts on the other, piling 3, 4, 5 feet deep in corners and valleys. Those drifts become localized hotspots where the load might double what the average calculation says. The code book doesn't stand there with a shovel when the wind decides to rearrange the storm. This is where design snow load comes in. Building codes pick a number, maybe 30, 40, 50 pounds per square foot for a given region, based on historical weather records. It's meant to represent a rare, once in 50 years winter. On paper, that sounds safe. But what happens when the last 10 years of storms in those mountains already look worse than the 50 years used to write the rule? What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the comfortable averages were starting to miss? Now, let's see what Jacob built in modern terms. Take a modest one, 500 square foot roof. At 30 pounds per square foot of heavy wet snow, that roof is carrying 45,000 pounds. That's like parking about 3 full-size pickup trucks up there. Push it to 60 pounds per square foot in an extreme event, and you're at 90,000 pounds. A small herd of cattle balanced over your head while you try to sleep warm through a long winter night. Before we reveal the exact technique he used, you need to know this. He had quietly looked up the regional snow load maps, dug through the design numbers, and then compared them to the last few brutal winters in those mountains. Storm after storm was brushing the upper edge of what the code still called rare. His neighbors saw a heavy roof. He saw a line on a graph being crossed, and the difference between survival and catastrophe. And then, one January, the storm arrived that would put those quiet calculations to the test. When that January storm rolled over the mountains, the snow didn't care what the permit said. It didn't care that every cabin on that ridge had passed inspection. It just fell. Hour after hour, pound after pound. Most people hear one phrase and relax. It meets code. To the neighbors, that sounded like a warm blanket of certainty. Pass or fail, safe or dangerous. But up in that cold valley, the roofs over their heads had been designed in a very different language. Engineers, truss manufacturers, the quiet people with calculators, had plugged in code-prescribed snow loads, added safety factors, and produced numbers that lived in reports nobody ever read. The builder just said, "You're good." Here's the uncomfortable part. Codes are not promises. They are bets. They're built around probabilities. Once in 50 years, storms, rare drifts, typical winters, translated into pounds per square foot. Maybe 30 pounds, maybe 40. In some high country, 60. On paper, that looks solid. But what happens when 3 once in 50 years winters show up in a single decade? What did the stubborn mountain man understand that the phrase meets code quietly hides from you? He had read those same tables and then watched the sky. He knew wet, compacted snow can push past 60 pounds per square foot in the wrong valley on the wrong week when wind piles it into deep, uneven blankets. Code assumed an acceptable risk. He was thinking about the difference between survival and catastrophe. Down the road, the incentives pointed the other way. Developers and spec builders got rewarded for shaving cost, not for adding invisible strength. One less rafter here, a lighter truss there, thinner sheathing, cheaper connectors. Nobody in town bragged, "My cabin has 20% more snow capacity than required." They bragged about granite countertops, not overbuilt ridge beams. Even many homeowners, if they're honest, will ask, "Does it meet code?" long before they ask, "What happens when the big one hits?" Pattern interrupt. Imagine if every real estate listing had to show 2 numbers, square footage and maximum roof snow load. Which one do you think most buyers would still click first? All of this worked, more or less, when the climate behaved like the historical charts. But those charts were drawn from winters that are fading in the rearview mirror. Storms that used to be labeled once in 50 years are now popping up every decade, sometimes every few years. The design margin codes quietly assumed is being eaten away by volatility. Warmer air holding more moisture, then dumping it as heavy, wet snow right where those cabins were built. Now, let's see what Jacob built into that too heavy roof. On that ridge, you could see 2 mindsets in timber and nail. One said, "Build to code and hope the storm behaves." The other said, "Build for the storm you know is coming someday." Long before the neighbors laughed, he had already chosen his side. To see why Jacob's roof looks so outrageous, you have to know what a normal mountain cabin roof is on that ridge. In those mountains, a typical builder in 1876 reached for the same recipe everyone trusted. It worked, most winters. Picture a 1.5-story cabin, rafters sawn from local pine, 2x6 or 2x8 timbers set 24 inches on center to save lumber, a ridge board maybe. Collar ties here and there if the builder remembered. This was normal. This was frontier life. Boards or split planks nailed across a sheathing, then a layer of tarred paper if you had cash, and hand-split shakes or thin metal roofing on top. The pitch? Moderate. A roof angle in the range we now call 4 and 12 up to maybe 6 and 12. Steep enough to shed light powder, not steep enough to clear the heavy wet snow that rode in on Pacific storms and stalled against those cold mountains. Valleys between wings of the cabin, little doghouse dormers, junctions where 2 roofs met, those became snow traps. Pockets where drifts climbed higher every hour the wind blew. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, you need to feel what those normal roofs felt like in a real winter. Wet, compacted snow can push 20, 30 pounds per square foot. In rare years, those loads jump past 60. On a modest cabin, that's the weight of several wagons sitting on your head. The code of the day, if you could call it that, was simple. Build what your neighbors built and hope the storm behaved. So the shortcuts crept in, wider rafter spacing, minimal bracing in the attic, truss-like frames held together with small nails and light metal plates once trading posts started carrying them. Technically adequate, the way a thin rope is technically a bridge if you only cross it once. No margin for drifting in a valley. No generosity for back-to-back storms with no thaw. In a big storm, those cabins talked. You'd lie awake and hear it. Long, low groans as rafters deflected. A faint ticking as nails shifted in cold, dry wood. By lantern light, you could see subtle sagging between trusses, a shallow dish forming where the snow was deepest. Men climbed rickety ladders with shovels, tossing snow into the night to keep their own roofs from folding. One slip on the ice, one misstep, and that maintenance plan could kill you faster than the cold. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors did not? He understood that many of those roofs were built right up to the line of the design load and then stopped. No reserve for the once-in-50-year winter. No forgiveness if the wind packed an extra foot of snow against one wall. In that gap between adequate and generous, between hope and engineering, lies the difference between survival and catastrophe. Jacob looked at those ordinary cabins, listened to their groaning rafters, and quietly decided his own roof would obey a different law. Not the law of habit, the law of weight, wood fiber, and time under snow. And that's where his too heavy roof begins, the first time he understood what a roof could take, and what it couldn't, came long before his own cabin rose out of the mountains. He was 13, early winter, that dangerous shoulder season when the snow is heavy, wet, and pretends to be harmless. A neighbor's old barn sat down in the hollow, low-pitch roof, gray boards leaning like tired men. People said it had stood for 50 years, it'll stand for 50 more. They were wrong by about 6 seconds. He remembered the sound first. Not a thunderclap, a groan, a crack, then a long, splintering sigh as the ridge sagged and the whole roof folded in on itself. After that, silence. That strange, padded quiet you only get when deep snow has just slammed shut over a space that used to hold air and heat and life. He ran down the lane with his father, boots punching through crust. The barn was half buried, one long wall blown outward, the other pinned under white weight. Steam leaked from gaps where animals were breathing under there. You can imagine what that does to a 13-year-old's mind. Up close, the details wrote themselves into him. The smell of broken timber, raw, sharp green, where beams had snapped clean across. Old hay and spilled grain, tang of cold iron from twisted nails. The rafters had failed right where they were thinnest, where the span was longest, where some long ago farmer had said, "That's good enough." They dug with shovels, with hands, with anything. Snow, broken boards, shattered shingles, all packed together into a single heavy mass. He saw how the collapse had started in one drifted corner, where the roof pitch was shallowest and the wind had piled snow into a dense wet slab. That corner went first, dragged the ridge with it, and the rest followed like a row of rotten teeth. Even then, he noticed more than he spoke. Cheap, rusted metal connectors, pulled clean out of the top plate, rafters spaced wide, nails driven in on a lean, no real triangulation, no thought for what 20, 30, even 60 pounds of snow per square foot might do when it turned to concrete overnight. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, even as a boy, that his neighbors still weren't seeing? They pulled out 2 terrified cows, a crushed chicken coop, a bent plow. The tools could be replaced, the animals maybe. But he watched the neighbor's face as that familiar ordinary barn lay in ruins, and he understood something colder than the air. Good enough was just a phrase people used before gravity collected its debt. That winter he started reading. Old manuals on snow loads, diagrams of trusses and ridge beams, Case studies of structural failures in deep winter towns where roofs failed in the same 3 spots over and over. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century in dusty engineering texts became his late-night company. Before we reveal the exact technique he would later use on his own too-heavy roof, you need to see the promise he made that day standing in the wreckage of that barn. He didn't tell his father, he didn't tell the neighbor, he just looked at those snap rafters and decided if he ever built in real snow country, his walls and his roof would be the opposite of good enough. He would rather have neighbors laugh at a bunker-looking cabin than stand outside in a hard winter, staring at a pile of broken timber and wondering what or who was still trapped under the snow. That private vow would guide every board he cut, every connector he chose, and it would be tested on a night when the sky itself seemed determined to crush every roof in the valley. He didn't draw the line in the lumber yard. He drew it at his kitchen table. Yellowed printouts spread across the pine boards, local snow load maps, climate graphs, a dog-eared notebook with columns of numbers. Outside, the mountains were quiet under a thin crust of early winter snow. Inside, he was designing for a storm that, according to everyone else in the valley, never happens. He circled a number on the map, the official design snow load. That was what every normal cabin roof in town was built for. Then, in his notebook, he wrote it again and multiplied it by 1.5, then by 2. The pencil paused. The page didn't look reasonable. It looked paranoid. But he'd already asked himself the question most people avoid. If the code assumes a once-in-50-year storm, what happens when the climate shifts and that once 50 shows up every decade? Or twice in the same ugly winter? What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, laughing about his bunker roof, refused to see? He read the fine print the inspectors never mention in casual conversation. Design loads are probabilities, not promises. Wet, compacted snow can hit 60 pounds per square foot on a bad year, more when it drifts. That means a modest roof can suddenly be carrying the weight of several pickup trucks. Quiet, invisible, until it isn't. So he set his own target. Not the minimum, the margin. He chose a roof structure that, on paper, could sit under far more than the official requirement and still have room to breathe. Deeper rafters, closer spacing, heavy ridge members that looked more like bridge parts than cabin trim. Every connection overbuilt, every tie-down chosen with that private image in mind, a roof buried to the eaves, and a family still warm underneath. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to move that weight, look at the cost column he wrote next. More lumber, more steel connectors, extra labor hours wrestling beams that 2 people could barely lift. When the cashier read the total, she raised an eyebrow and asked if he was framing a cabin or a barn. The neighbors were worse. They watched the thick rafters go up and shook their heads. Too heavy. Too much. One joked that in a good winter, his roof would collect so much snow he'd never see daylight again. The irony, of course, was that this was knowledge that's been buried for over a century in real mountain country. The understanding that in deep snow regions, overbuilt can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. He accepted the trade without flinching. A visually heavy roofline, a cabin that looked out of place next to delicate A-frames and picture-perfect chalets. He'd rather live in a tank than under a postcard. Now let's see what Jacob built in spirit here, because his final design didn't just use bigger pieces of wood. It changed how the roof carried and distributed weight across the walls in a way most people never think about, and that hidden geometry would matter when the sky finally opened. He changed the hidden geometry of the cabin, but hold that image in your mind for a second. The heavy rafters, the deep overhangs, the neighbors shaking their heads in the mountains. Because before we reveal the exact technique, we need to freeze the frame right here. In the next segment, you're going to see the roof laid bare. Exact rafter sizes, the spacing he chose, the connectors that quietly tie wood to wood and wall to wall, even the pitch that decides whether snow slides off or piles up like wet concrete. We're going to put numbers on what most people only describe with vague phrases like overbuilt or plenty strong. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about weight and winter that most modern builders never explain to you? If you've ever caught yourself looking at your own roof during a heavy snow and wondering, is this really built for the worst storm I'll ever see? Hit like right now. Not because the algorithm demands tribute, but because that tiny click tells us there are people out there who actually want to know how their cabin behaves when the cold stops being theoretical. Drop a comment and tell us where you live. Name the region, the valley, the snow zone if you know it. Are you in a place that usually gets light powder or the kind of wet, compacted snow that can push past 60 pounds per square foot when winter really digs in? Those numbers matter. A low-pitch roof in a coastal blizzard is carrying a very different burden than a steep cabin roof in dry mountain powder. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because this isn't just a pretty story about one overbuilt roof and some embarrassed neighbors. Coming up, we're going to walk through real snow load calculations. You'll see how a roof that looks normal on the outside can be one bad drift away from failure, and how a few inches of extra depth in a rafter or a tighter spacing can be the difference between survival and catastrophe when the weight on that wall quietly doubles overnight. We're also going to look at failure case studies, ski town maintenance sheds that folded in a record year, garages crushed when drifting snow stacked higher on one side than the plans ever imagined. Then we'll put those side by side with roofs that stayed warm, intact, and boringly uneventful under the same storm. And there's a contrarian side to this. Some modern construction practices, value engineering, thinner members, fewer fasteners, lighter connectors, shave cost in ways that quietly eat into your safety margin. They still meet code on paper. They still pass inspection. But codes are written to an average winter, not the once in 50 years night when the sky forgets to stop. That's the part most homeowners never see. And it's not knowledge that every company is eager to talk about. Remember, this isn't about paranoia. It's about finally understanding how wood, stone, wall, and roof actually behave when the cold presses down from above, so you're not stuck trusting a shrug and the words, "It should be fine." In the next section, we'll peel back the metal, trace every major rafter, and show you the exact path the weight takes from the snowpack to the foundation. Hold that roof in your mind. Then, one cut from now, we'll measure it. Hold that roof in your mind, and now, zoom out. He wasn't just nailing together a cozy mountain cabin with a nice view of the snow-dusted mountains. He was quietly declaring war on winter. In his head, the snow wasn't scenery. It was an enemy force. A moving, drifting, soaking, compacting weight that would press down on every square foot of that roof, trying to find the weak link. His neighbors didn't think like that. They were picking paint colors and kitchen layouts, arguing about islands and breakfast nooks, while the wind cut across the ridge. They talked about open concept. He talked about load paths. They compared countertop samples. He compared shear connections. While they imagined a warm family Christmas under twinkling lights, he was picturing 3 feet of wet snow at 30 pounds per square foot, sagging rafters, and that sickening creak right before collapse. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that made him ignore the polite laughter? He understood that in deep snow country, the roof is not decor. It's armor. Standard residential roofs might be drawn for a designed snow load pulled from a table, numbers that look fine in a code book, but he had spent nights reading failure reports, looking at photos of gymnasiums and warehouses pancaked after once-in-50-year storms. He assumed the future might not look like the past. They trusted. It's always been fine. He trusted physics. So while one neighbor proudly showed off a modern mountain profile with low, clean lines that trapped snow like a catch basin, his own cabin rose under a sharper pitch, closer to an alpine lodge than a suburban transplant. The overhangs were deeper, casting strong winter shadows. The fascia boards were thick and unapologetic, more like structural beams than trim. You could see it from the road and think, that's overkill. Or you could see it and think, that man expects the cold to fight back. Pattern interrupt. This wasn't just about the roof. From the foundation up, every decision joined the same argument. Posts tied into concrete with real hardware, not decorative brackets. Rafters spaced tighter than the plans required, each one locked with metal connectors that transferred the snow's push cleanly into the walls, then down into the footings. Before we reveal the exact technique of how that snow load walked its way safely to the ground, you need to see the mindset. No isolated strong pieces, only a continuous, overbuilt path for the weight to travel. Now, let's see what Jacob built not in 1876 log and stone, but in modern lumber and metal, carrying forward knowledge that's been buried for over a century, that the difference between survival and catastrophe in a hard winter often comes down to whether your cabin is just a house or a fortress that expects the storm. In the next section, we'll peel back that fortress, connection by connection, and follow the snow's weight from ridge cap to soil. So let's climb up into that fortress and look at its bones, because the real story of this roof starts long before the first snowflake ever touched it. Now, let's see what Jacob built, not in stone and log this time, but in modern lumber and steel, laid out with the same hard suspicion of the mountains and their winters. First, the geometry. Neighbors in that valley loved low, lazy roofs, 412 pitch, wide overhangs, pretty to look at and perfect for catching snow like a giant tray. He went steeper, about 812. Not crazy alpine, but steep enough that dry snow wanted to slide, not sit. The span? 24 feet wall, long enough to tempt shortcuts. That's where most people start carving in dormers and cute little valleys. He refused. One straight gable, no intersecting roofs, no pockets where drifts could pile 6 feet deep. It looked boring. It looked too simple. It was, in reality, a geometry that refused to concentrate load. Then he attacked the rafters. Code would have let him run 2x8s at that span, with standard spacing, maybe 40 pounds per square foot of snow load on paper. He chose 2x12s, full depth, high-grade lumber. In engineering terms, jumping from an 8-inch to a 1-2-inch member can nearly double the bending capacity. He wasn't chasing aesthetics, he was buying margin. If the design storm was 40%, he wanted quiet comfort at 60%. Wet, compacted snow in that region had already hit 50+ Ceph in freak years. He read those numbers the way Jacob once read frost lines on a cabin wall, but depth alone wasn't his only trick. He choked the spacing. Where neighbors ran rafters at 24 inches on center, he pulled this to 12. That doesn't just add a few more boards. It halves the tributary area each rafter has to support, and it turns the roof deck into a dense lattice that spreads any local overload into a dozen members at once. In a standard cabin, that drift leans on 2 or 3 rafters. In his, it leaned on 8, maybe 10. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about cold and weight that his neighbors' weighting codebooks did not? At the peak, he made another heresy. Most houses in that area used a simple ridge board, a non-structural spine relying on opposing rafters to push against each other. Cheap, fast, adequate until snow loads go asymmetric. He installed a true structural ridge beam, engineered LVL, sized like it belonged in a small bridge, carried on solid posts down into the foundation. That beam didn't just align rafters, it carried real vertical load. When snow drifted harder on one side, the roof didn't rack and twist. The ridge took it, then handed it down to the ground. All of it worked as a system. Oversized rafters, tight spacing, structural ridge, simple pitch. Each piece was strong alone, but the genius was how they shared burden. If one rafter ever reached its limit, the sheathing and the neighbors on either side would quietly shoulder the excess instead of letting a crack race across the ceiling. It was the skeletal equivalent of Jacob's double wall. Redundancy, pathways for stress to escape, the difference between survival and catastrophe when the sky decides to test your math. In the next section, we'll leave the skeleton and skin it, connections, fasteners, and the metal shell that turned this overbuilt frame into a roof that laughed at sliding snow and high wind. Now the frame was standing there like a bare rib cage in the mountains, and his neighbors thought the madness was over. The heavy timbers, the close spacing, the redundant beams. Enough, right? But this is where most roofs quietly fail, not in the lumber, but in the tiny, shiny pieces that no one notices until they rip out under a February sky. In real roof collapses, it's almost never the big beam that snaps first. It's the nail that pulls, the hanger that twists, the little metal plate that was good enough for a normal winter, but never met a once. In 50 years snowpack, wet, compacted snow at 20, 30, even 60 pounds per square foot doesn't just press straight down. It creeps, it drifts, it slides, turning simple weight into prying, twisting, tearing forces at every joint. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the catalog didn't shout at you? That a roof is only as strong as its weakest connection. So while his neighbors were happy with a couple of gun nails into a rafter tail, he was unpacking boxes of heavy-duty metal. Hurricane ties at every seat, rafter hangers so beefy they looked like they belonged in a ski area maintenance building, and structural screws and bolts, where most cabins in that valley lived their whole lives on bright, smooth nails. Each rafter didn't just sit on the wall, it was locked, clamped, stitched to it. Hurricane ties wrapped the wood like hands around a wrist, resisting uplift from those violent Chinook winds and the sudden suction when sliding snow tried to yank a rafter out of its pocket. Rafter hangers cradled the ends, turning shear and twist into controlled compression. He was building for the storm that never happens, the one his neighbors joked about as they admired their open ceilings and clean lines. But metal alone wasn't the secret. Bracing was. Now, let's see what Jacob built in principle, translated into this roof. Collar ties high in the attic, knitting opposing rafters together so the ridge couldn't spread when the snow piled deep. Rafter ties lower down, tying the feet so the walls didn't bow like a barrel under load. Diagonal bracing ran from plate to ridge, from gable to interior beam, turning the whole cabin roof into a triangulated lattice that hated movement in every direction. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to tie that lattice into the stone foundation, look at the logic. Every connector, every brace was chosen for the load path. Snow on the metal skin. Skin to purlins, purlins to rafters. Rafters into hangers and ties, ties into the double wall, wall down into the footings and deep into the ground. No dead ends, no floating members, just a continuous unbroken chain from cold white weight to solid earth. This is where most meets code roofs quietly compromise. Minimum fasteners. Light connectors, designs that are fine for average storms, for average winters, for average lives. But in the mountains, in a winter that forgets the averages, that difference between survival and catastrophe can be measured in one missing screw. And in the next segment, you'll see how his choice of outer shell turned all that hidden overkill into a roof that laughed when the snow finally tested every single joint. So when Jacob turned to the outer shell, he didn't just ask, "How strong can I make this roof?" He asked a quieter, more subversive question. How little punishment can I force it to take? That's where his choice shocked the mountains more than the thickness ever did. He chose metal. Not the wavy barn tin most cabins wore like a badge of poverty. A standing seam metal roof, smooth as ice, seams locked high, fasteners buried where snow and water could never pry at them. His neighbors stared at that gleaming shell and shook their heads. Too slick. Snow's gonna come off that like a freight train. They weren't entirely wrong. They were just thinking in one dimension. Now, let's see what Jacob built when he laid that first panel. A shingle roof with its rough texture and exposed nail heads grabs snow. It lets white weight cling in unpredictable islands, melt in patches, refreeze in ridges. A standing seam roof does the opposite. It offers snow a decision. Stay as a uniform blanket or leave in a controlled slide. Smooth steel, concealed clips, continuous seams. All of it turned his cabin into a place where snow had very few places to hook a frozen finger. But material alone isn't destiny. Pitch is. Steeper roofs shed snow. That's the old mountain rule. A 10-12 roof laughs at light powder. Yet Jacob had watched too many smart steep roofs turn into weapons. One thaw, one rain-on-snow event, and whole sheets would peel loose, roar down, and bury a doorway, crush a low shed, or drop a lethal slab right where children played. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? That shedding snow is good, unless you don't control where it goes. So he tuned the angle, Not the lazy, sagging pitches that invited 6 feet of wet snow to settle in for the winter, and not the near cliff faces that created roof avalanches, a deliberate middle, steep enough that snow wanted to creep, but not so steep it could sprint. Then he added overhangs long enough to kick the sliding mass away from the log walls and stone foundation, yet short enough that the weight never hung far beyond his structure's muscle. Before we reveal the exact technique he used at the eaves, look at the edges in your mind. He broke the smoothness on purpose. Snow guards, small ribs, and tiny interruptions along the standing seams caught the moving blanket, slowed it, sliced big slabs into smaller, harmless bites. Instead of one midnight thunder of collapse, he got a series of quiet sighs as snow released in manageable doses. That difference between survival and catastrophe might be a few inches of metal in the right place. He also refused the architectural flourishes the new arrivals loved. No cute dormers, no ornate valleys. He'd seen what valleys do. They trap drifting snow, concentrate wind-driven powder into dense wedges, and create dead zones where meltwater refreezes layer on layer until one corner of a roof carries twice the load of the rest. Jacob's plan was almost offensively simple. Long, clean plains, ridges that ran straight, intersections minimized to the bare minimum needed for the cabin's layout. To his neighbors, it looked plain. Boring. All that overkill and not even a fancy gable, one rancher muttered. But Jacob wasn't decorating a parlor. He was editing where the winter was allowed to sit. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century lives in that decision. Don't just brace for the storm. Manage its geometry. Reduce the snow that can accumulate. Spread what does land. And turn a brutal load into a moving, flowing visitor that never quite finds a place to settle. When the real test came, the snow didn't just weigh on his roof. It behaved on his terms. And in the next segment, you'll see how the first true blizzard of that infamous winter turned his too heavy roof and two plain lines into the only shelter on the ridge that didn't flinch. The blizzard was the first test. The inspector was the second. He showed up on a gray morning while the roof framing was still open, clipboard under his arm, boots crunching on frost that hadn't yet burned off. In a valley where most cabins were thrown together with rule of thumb and a prayer, this man was the nearest thing to law in the mountains. And when he tipped his head back and really looked at that roof, he actually laughed. "Those are 12s?" he asked, hand on one of the deep rafters. At 24 inches on center, his pencil tapped the metal connectors, the hurricane ties, the dense rhythm of fasteners marching along the ridge. "You're not building a cabin, son. You're building a bridge." Now, let's see what Jacob built in comparison. Standard cabins in this region were framed light. Code charts said a certain snow load, a certain span, a certain size of member. And that was that. The inspector had those numbers memorized. 40 years of walking through half-finished homes, signing off on roofs that had survived plenty of winter. "Our design snow load is right here," he said, flipping his code book open with theatrical precision. "We've been using this for decades. Roofs don't just fall down around here." He said it loud enough that the closest neighbors, pretending not to stare from their trucks, could hear. On paper, he was right. Wet snow at 20 or 30 pounds per square foot, a few drifts, a conservative safety factor, done. The code was written to handle what had happened, not what might. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that made him ignore that comfortable line in the table? He'd watched roofs sag in freak storms, seen the way wind could stack snow into dense icy slabs that weighed more than a pickup on a small patch of roof. "Your connectors alone are overkill," the inspector continued, running a finger along the metal. "You could leave half of these out and still pass. You're just wasting money and time. You don't need a tank to keep a cabin warm." Neighbors repeated that line all week. "Even the building police say you're nuts," one called over the fence. The social heat was almost worse than the cold. In a tight valley, word travels faster than a storm front. If the man with the code book said it was excessive, who was this lone builder to argue? But he did. Not loudly, not with a speech. Just a quiet question as the inspector clicked his pen and prepared to sign. "That design snow load you like so much," he asked, eyes on the ridge where the real winter would come from. "Was it written before or after the worst storm on record up here?" The inspector paused, searched his memory. The wind moved through the pines. Snow from last night's flurry slid off a neighbor's thin roof in a ragged sheet. He didn't answer. Not really. And as we move forward, you'll see why that silence in a valley that trusted charts over clouds was the difference between survival and catastrophe. The inspector's silence hangs in the air. Cut. Archival black and white. Grainy film. A different valley. Different mountains. Same cold. Truckee, California. Winter of 2016-2017. Snowfalls stacked like pages in a book that wouldn't close. Wet Pacific storms slammed into the Sierra, each one dragging more moisture, more weight, up over the passes. Roofs that had always been fine suddenly weren't. Grocery stores, old lodge buildings, and a scattering of mountain cabins sagged, cracked, and in some cases, folded under loads that pushed past 60 pounds per square foot. These weren't shacks. These were buildings that met code when they were built. On paper, they were safe. Cut again. Buffalo, New York, November 2014. Lake effect bands parked over the city and refused to move. 7. 8 feet of dense compacted snow in some neighborhoods. Garages collapsed. Flat roof commercial buildings pancaked. A few older steep pitch roofs, the kind your grandfather would have built for real winter, came through looking almost smug under their white caps. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, standing on his own ridge that all those engineers, inspectors, and confident neighbors kept forgetting? Now, let's see what Jacob built in principle, not in logs and stone, but in mindset. He refused to treat design snow load like a promise. Those maps on the inspector's clipboard, they're built from past winters, from historical records, from storms that already happened. And those maps move slowly, sometimes decades, slowly. Climate doesn't wait for the next codebook to be printed. The storms are getting warmer, wetter, heavier. The averages shift. Then the extremes sprint ahead. But the numbers nailed into your roof framing stay frozen in the year your cabin was built. If your house went up 20, 30, 40 years ago, what assumptions about snow, wind, and cold are literally locked into every truss plate and rafter? Were they betting on fluffy powder or on concrete wet snow that weighs more than a pickup parked on your living room? And more uncomfortable than that, are those assumptions still true where you live now? Before we reveal the exact technique our protagonist used to overbuild his roof, you need this. Building codes are minimums. They are not guarantees. They are not prophecies. They are a negotiated truce between cost and risk, written by committees, updated years after the last record-breaking winter takes out a few too many roofs in some forgotten mountain town. In that gap between yesterday's charts and tomorrow's storms lives the difference between survival and catastrophe. Cut back to his cabin. Snow whispers off his neighbor's thin roofs with every breeze, never allowed to pile too high because the pitch must do what the structure cannot. They joke that his place looks like a bunker, that his wall lines are too heavy, that he built for a winter that doesn't happen here. But you see it differently now, don't you? He isn't just a paranoid builder. He's the one man on that ridge who refused to outsource his safety to outdated averages and slow-moving bureaucracies. The one who treated changing weather like knowledge that's been buried for over a century and is finally clawing its way back through the snow. So when the first fall fronts rolled off the mountains that year, the warnings felt almost routine. Regional meteorologists started using phrases the locals hadn't heard in a while. Persistent blocking pattern, enhanced moisture plume, higher than normal snow water equivalent. On the evening news, a radar loop bled blue and purple over the ridge, and the anchor called it a setup for a potentially very snowy winter. People in town just smirked. At the feed store, an old-timer waved a gloved hand at the TV. They say that every 5 years, he told anyone within earshot, we get one good storm, then it blows over. Media's gotta sell ads. Heads nodded. This was normal. This was mountain life. They did the usual winter prep, stacking firewood under shallow eaves, swapping to snow tires in the gravel lot, checking generators, topping propane, rolling out heat tape for exposed pipes. A few climbed ladders to flick leaves out of gutters, maybe hammer a loose shingle back into place. But their eyes never really went to the lines of their roofs, to the spans, to the connections that would decide the difference between survival and catastrophe. On Jacob's Ridge, it looked the same on the surface. Trucks idling white in the morning air. Dogs barking at nothing. The cold settling in a little earlier each night. But inside his cabin, the rhythm was different. He walked that heavy roof like a man rereading a map before a long crossing. Checking every bracket, every lag screw, every gusset plate that tied his deep rafters into the log wall, he traced the places where drifts liked to curl in past winters, marking potential snow traps where wind could stack thousands of pounds in one tight corner. Then he went inside and eyed his interior support posts, the way they lined up under the ridge beam, the way load moved down through the frame into stone and soil. You could almost hear the question hanging in the air. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that made him treat a roof like a loaded bridge instead of a decorative hat? His neighbors still thought it was overkill. One afternoon, as he brushed early flurries off the metal, a truck stopped on the road. "Hey, Jacob," a voice called. "You reinforcing that bunker roof for the asteroid strike, or just the once-in-a-lifetime storm they keep promising?" Laughter drifted up with the exhaust. Another chimed in. "Man, if we get what you're building for, we'll all be in town at the motel. This cabin will be the last thing you're worried about." He smiled, said little, and went back to checking the overhang where drifting had bitten him the year before. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to keep that roof from folding under wet snow, you need to see how the test arrived. December came in fast. The first big system rolled over the mountains with a different weight to it. Snow didn't fall light and feathery. It slapped the metal roof in thick wet clumps that stuck instead of sliding. Roads went from brown to white to slush over ice in hours. Inside the cabin, the TV flickered above the wood stove. A red banner crawled across the bottom of the weather report. Multi-day winter storm. Warning, expect heavy, wet snow. Roof loads may exceed typical Evans. Most people glanced at it once and reached for another log. Jacob turned the sound up. Because this wasn't just a storm front. It was the opening move of a winter that would push every roof on that ridge to its breaking point. Except one. The storm arrived without drama. No howling cinematic blizzard. No whiteout apocalypse. Just a steady, patient fall of heavy flakes over the mountains, thick as wet feathers, starting before dawn and refusing to stop. By mid-morning, the plows were already looping the road in front of his cabin. They'd clear it, turn around, and an hour later, the tire tracks were gone, swallowed. Phones lit up in town, photos of half-buried cars, dogs tunneling through drifts, front steps disappearing one riser at a time. On that ridge, every roof went quiet under the muffling weight. You know that silence when snow really starts to stack. Even the highway hum fades, just the low growl of a distant plow and the occasional thump as a tree sheds a branch. Inside his cabin, Jacob listened. He knew what a roof under stress sounds like. Sharp, protesting pops. Long, aching groans as rafters deflect, the subtle, unnerving tick of drywall screws moving in their holes. Instead, his overbuilt frame gave him almost nothing. A faint, slow creak here and there, more like an old ship settling in calm water than a structure being pushed to its limits. Outside, the snow climbed. 6 inches, 10, 14, over 24, then 30 hours. The ridge took on the kind of wet accumulation that makes building inspectors nervous. Wet, compacted snow up here can run 20 to 30 pounds per square foot. You don't feel that from the driveway. Your roof does. Now, let's see what Jacob built in practice. From the road, his cabin looked like it was wearing a clean, white helmet. The steeper pitch he'd chosen shed just enough that the snow blanket sat even and shallow near the eaves, thicker but still uniform toward the ridge. No big overhanging lips. No strange mounds telegraphing hidden drifts. His simplified geometry, no cute little dormers, no valleys, gave the snow nowhere to misbehave. Next door, it was different. One neighbor's low-pitch addition collected a deep pocket of snow where 2 roofs met. You could see the bulge from the street. Another house showed a subtle sag line between trusses, a shadow that hadn't been there in October. Doors that had always swung freely now needed a shoulder nudge. Hairline cracks spidered from the corners of window trim. People laughed it off, but their eyes kept flicking upward when a gust hit. What did the stubborn mountain man understand that they were still learning the hard way? That in real winter, the difference between survival and catastrophe often starts as just a sticky door. That night, with the storm still whispering down, he pulled on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the muffled dark. Breath hanging in the beam, he walked the perimeter of the cabin, light tracing along the eaves, up the gables, across the ridge. He was hunting for the patterns he'd sketched months earlier. Slightly deeper buildup on the leeward side. There it was, exactly where the wind usually curled. Clean breaks where the metal had shed a slide of snow before it could stack too high. Check. No ominous overhangs, no warped fascia, no cracks telegraphing through the interior walls. This, right here, was quiet confirmation. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Steep pitches, simple lines, muscle in the rafters, still worked. And yet, as serious as this storm felt, it was still within the envelope that most roofs on that ridge were designed to survive. This was the warm-up set, the uneventful stress test. The winter had not yet shown its real weight. That would come later, when the numbers on the weather map broke their own records, and too heavy stopped being a joke and started being a verdict. So let's put numbers to that weight the winter was about to throw. In that valley, a typical code minimum cabin roof was designed for roughly 40 pounds of snow per square foot. That sounds generous. On paper, that's a blanket of dry, fluffy snow about 2 feet deep. Engineers call it the design snow load, and they treat it like a line in the sand. Storms may dance near it, but they're not supposed to live above it. But storms don't read code books. That first blizzard dropped close to 3 feet. Not powder. Heavy, mountain snow hovering near freezing. Wet, compacted snow can easily hit 20 to 30 pounds per cubic foot. Do the math with me for a second. Take even a conservative 20 pounds per cubic foot, multiplied by 3 feet of depth, and you're already at 60 pounds per square foot on the flatter sections of a roof. That's half again what those normal roofs were built to carry. And that was before the real trick of a long winter showed up. Time. Snow doesn't just sit, it melts a little in the midday sun, slides, refreezes at night, gets packed by wind, then takes on a fresh layer. A light thaw sends liquid water down into the old snowpack, where it hits an ice crust and stops, trapped. That hidden water can double the weight of what looks, from the ground, like the same innocent white blanket. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, watching his neighbors' roofs disappear under that layered cake of ice and slush that they refused to see? Load isn't just how much, it's how long. Engineers call it load duration. Wood can carry a heavy load for a short burst, but hold that same weight for days or weeks, and tiny fibers start to give. Nails inch. Micro cracks open where you'll never see them. A roof might survive the first hit, yet come out of it bruised, softer, closer to its real breaking point than anyone realizes. Now imagine the second storm, maybe only a foot this time, the kind the neighbors had always shrugged off. But the roof never fully unloaded from the first one. There's an icy base locked to the shingles, a slab that refuses to slide. That extra foot doesn't land on a clean slate. It stacks on a damaged memory. Suddenly, a small storm is the one that pushes a beam from safe deflection into permanent sag. Jacob's roof, by contrast, had been built like it expected 50-year storms every winter. Higher pitch to shed what it could. Deep rafters. Tight spacing. Extra bracing at the ridge where snow liked to drift. Where their code number was 40, his back of the envelope target was closer to 80 or 90 pounds per square foot. The kind of capacity most builders in that valley called insane. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to get there, understand what that meant when the storms began to stack. While his neighbors' cabins crept from comfortable margin to razor's edge, Jacob still had space. The same ice lenses, the same trapped water, the same relentless load duration that pushed them toward the collapse kept him in the zone where creeks stayed just creeks. In deep snow mountains, that invisible margin is the difference between survival and catastrophe, and the winter was about to test exactly how wide that margin really was. The second storm did not roar in with drama. It slid in, a gray lid over the mountains, light flakes at first, then that steady, silent pour of snow that never quite turns into a blizzard, but never stops either. For 36 hours, it just kept coming. No thaw window, no sunbreak, no chance for roofs to shed what they were already dragging around. The town's cabins, sheds, and carports turned into long-term, load-bearing platforms, holding not just one storm, but the memory of the last one, compressed into dense, wet weight. On paper, that weight was starting to matter. Wet, compacted snow can easily hit 20 to 30 pounds per square foot. In the drift zones behind chimneys and along low valleys, you can see double that. You look at a roof and see a white blanket. Jacob looked at the same blanket and saw thousands of pounds trying to push his cabin flat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors still refused to see? Duration. Not just peak load, but how long that load sat there, working on every joint, every nail, every tired rafter. Around town, the warning signs stopped being theoretical. A ceiling in the old mercantile bowed just enough that the hanging lanterns tilted toward the center. Doors that had always shut clean now scraped their thresholds. Window frames went out of square, with hairline cracks feathering through plaster like frost lines on glass. Then, the first failure. An old flat-roofed carport tacked onto a 1960s ranch let go at 3 a.m. No wind, no drama, just a long groan, a sharp crack, and the slow, humiliating sag of metal and plywood folding onto a buried pickup. A week later, a weather-beaten shed behind the post office collapsed inward, its low pitch and tired beams no match for a winter. Some neighbors finally snapped out of it. You saw pickup trucks with aluminum ladders and bright orange roof rakes rattling in the beds. Men in slick boots and no harnesses climbed onto glazed metal, hacking at hardpack, sending avalanches of snow into their own gutters. One family hired a crew that cheerfully shoveled everything off one side of their roof first, quietly doubling the load on the other side while they worked. Others just crossed their arms and pointed at history. It's held this much before. It'll be fine. As if the mountains had a contract to repeat the past. Jacob moved differently. He walked his attic with a flashlight, listening, measuring deflection against marks he'd made at the start of winter. Outside, he cleared only where drifting could create extreme hotspots, behind his chimney, along the leeward eave, in that one valley where two planes of roof met and snow loved to settle. He didn't panic. He trusted the capacity he had built in from day one, that overbuilt frame the neighbors had mocked as a bunker roof. Before we reveal the exact technique he used up there, the weather decided to raise the stakes. One evening, the local forecast cut through the usual chatter. A new system, tapping deep Pacific moisture, was lining up. Potentially historic, the meteorologist said. Possibly the biggest in decades. Now, let's see what Jacob built face that. Because as the camera pulls back, you see it. Already deep snow layered on roofs that were never meant to carry this much, for this long, and a storm on the horizon that doesn't care what anyone thinks is enough. That potentially historic storm doesn't arrive with drama at first. It just thickens. Late afternoon turns to a kind of gray twilight, snow already waist-deep along fences, and then the flakes change. They get heavy, wet, the kind that land on a roof and don't want to leave. By the time darkness settles over the mountains, the town's roofs are already tired. Rafters that have been carrying 20, 30 pounds per square foot for weeks suddenly face double that. Remember, wet, compacted snow can push past 60 pounds per square foot. That's like parking a pickup truck on a small cabin roof, and then quietly adding another half truck while everyone sleeps. The wind comes next. Not a gentle howl, but a freight train roar pouring down the valley, slamming into gables, ripping powder off ridgelines and dumping it on the leeward slopes. Steep roofs that once shed snow cleanly now grow asymmetrical white humps. Drifts stack 3-4 feet deep in pockets the original builders never imagined. Emergency alerts ping across phones and radios. Shelter in place. Stay off roofs. Structural failure risk elevated. You can picture people glancing up at ceilings they have never really thought about. That thin line of drywall between warm light and a very heavy winter pressing down. Then the failures start. Not theoretical. Audible. Across the street, a neighbor's porch roof, already sagging from weeks of load, gives up. There's a sharp crack, like a tree snapping in the cold, then a rolling crunch as the beam folds and the whole porch slams down into the drift. Someone screams. For a few seconds, it's just snow dust and the sound of a dog going wild. Downtown, a flat-roofed commercial building that always made it through before starts to tell a different story. Security cameras catch the ceiling tiles bowing, seams opening, sprinklers drooping like wilted flowers. The roof membrane ponds, meltwater under the new snow, weight concentrating in a shallow, invisible lake. Then, in one corner, the steel gives. A partial collapse, heaters torn from their mounts, alarms howling into the blizzard, as fire crews already stretched thin scramble to respond. Inside his cabin, it's quieter, not calm. Just quieter. The family sits around a small table, radio on, listening to reports of caved-in garages and blocked roads. Every so often, someone pulls on boots, opens the heavy door against the drift, and steps out into the roaring white to check on neighbors, to make sure no one's porch became a trap. They come back with snow in their eyebrows, shake off, and, almost involuntarily, glance up. The ceiling looks boring. No sagging drywall, no new cracks marching across the plaster, just a low, steady weight that the overbuilt frame takes without visible complaint. This is where you start to ask, what did this stubborn mountain man understand about load that everyone else treated as superstition? Hours pass. The storm intensifies. The radio voice grows tighter. Emergency services are overwhelmed, prioritizing occupied collapses, telling people, if you're safe, stay put. We can't get to everyone. That's the difference between survival and catastrophe in deep snow country, whether your roof quietly does its job when help is not coming. Then it happens. A deep, resonant creak rolls through the cabin, not a sharp crack, a long, low groan, like an old wooden ship taking a heavy wave. Every conversation stops. Forks freeze halfway to mouths. You can feel your own shoulders tense just watching. For 3, 4 seconds, the sound holds. The walls feel like they're breathing. You can almost see the calculations running behind everyone's eyes. Is this it? Did we push it too far? And then silence. The sound dissipates. The house gives a tiny shudder as framing redistributes the load, then settles. Still intact. Light still on. Under a roof now carrying more weight than most people ever imagine when they look up from a warm room in the heart of winter. Before we reveal the exact technique that let that happen, you need to see what those rafters and connections were really built to do, because that creek was not a failure. It was the overbuilt system, quietly announcing it had just passed the kind of real-world test you only get once in 50 years. So why didn't that heavy roof even flinch, while lighter, prettier roofs in the same mountains groaned, cracked, and in a few cases, folded? Why did his bunker cabin stay warm and quiet while neighbors lay awake listening for the sound of splintering rafters? Now, let's see what Jacob built in structural terms, because this is where the overkill starts to look surgical. He used oversized rafters, deeper and wider than code minimum, and he spaced them closer together than the plans required. That did one critical thing. It spread the snow load. Instead of each rafter carrying a brutal, isolated strip of winter weight, the load smeared out across a dense grid of timber. No single member crept anywhere near its failure point. The roof didn't survive because the snow was light. It survived because the weight was shared. Most modern cabins fail in deep snow, not when the total load is too high, but when it concentrates. Low hips, valleys, cute little dormers, each one is a trap where drifting piles up. A roof that should be seeing 40 pounds per square foot suddenly has pockets quietly hitting 80, 100 more. His roof geometry was almost boring, long, clean planes, no fussy breaks. That simplicity starved the worst drifts of a place to form, so there were no hidden pockets, where the load silently doubled or tripled while the family below pretended their cabin was safe. Pattern interrupt. The real danger wasn't the snow. It was what happens after the first crack. Once rafter fails, the load shifts. Then the neighbor rafter goes, then the next, and in seconds you have progressive collapse. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? He tied his system together like a single organism. Heavy metal connectors at every bearing, diagonal bracing that locked the roof diaphragm to the walls. If one area had been slightly overstressed, the surrounding structure could grab part of that burden, bleeding off the spike, instead of letting it avalanche through the frame. Then there was pitch and skin. His roof was steep enough that gravity was on his side. Not so steep that snow never stayed, but steep enough that as the lower layers compacted and warmed from cabin heat, slabs could release and slide. Metal roofing turned that into a controlled shed mechanism. While flatter, rougher roofs in the valley quietly accumulated every flake until peak load, his was constantly self-editing, dropping weight in bursts so the absolute maximum never arrived. From an engineering standpoint, there was nothing lucky about that roof. Every too big rafter, every unnecessary brace, every overbuilt connector was cheap insurance against a perfectly predictable extreme event. In that 50-year winter, his cabin didn't beat the odds. It performed exactly the way a conservative design is supposed to when the cold decides to test what you built. And the moment the storm broke, his neighbors could see the difference between survival and catastrophe written right there in the snow line on his walls. Morning didn't arrive with birdsong. It arrived with silence. The storm had switched off the valley. Thick, dense snow wrapped every cabin, every fence post, every pine in a muffled white shell that swallowed sound. When people first cracked open their doors, they stepped into a world where even their own boots sounded distant, like the mountains had thrown a blanket over the town and said, "Quiet now." Then the interruption started. A chainsaw coughing to life. 2 streets over, the distant wail of an ambulance trying to pick its way through narrowed lanes. A diesel plow grinding against ice. Each noise was a flare in the hush, a reminder that not every roof had passed the test. Now, let's see what Jacob Built's spiritual successor looks like in deep snow country. Walk down the main road, and you could read the storm in broken lines and sagging angles. Carports were the first casualties. Light little lean-tos pancaked flat, their metal roofs folded like cardboard under what was now well over 60 pounds of wet snow per square foot. Older barns, the ones everyone swore had stood through worse, lay racked and twisted, ridge beams snapped, walls bowed out where the trusses finally gave up. On the edge of town, a rancher's add-on bedroom leaned at a sick angle, its low-pitch roof having held just long enough for the family to scramble out when the drywall started to crack. 2 doors down, a garage roof had partially collapsed over a pickup, windshield spider-webbed under a drift that weighed more than the truck itself. Farther along, you saw the near misses, roof lines with a visible dip between rafters, sheathing bowed, shingles wrinkled like skin under strain. People gathered in clumps in the street, hats pulled low, breath hanging in the cold air. Neighbors who'd spent years trading jokes about overkill and code plus 10% now compared the sound of rafters groaning at 3 a.m., the way a bedroom door suddenly wouldn't close the moment a ceiling light fixture started to weep meltwater. You could see it on their faces. This winter had stepped outside the tidy margins of the building code they had built for normal. The storm had not been normal. Then the camera cuts to his place. Same snow depth, same brutal winter. Very different picture. His roof lines were ruler straight, eaves still sharp, no mysterious humps or bellies in the span. The heavy ridge beam he'd been mocked for, dead level. No cracked drywall, no pop trim, no doors rubbing in their frames. The only sounds here were the scrape of a shovel on his walkway and the soft thud of snow sliding off a steep metal panel he'd intentionally overpitched to shed weight. He moved methodically, not panicked. Clearing paths, knocking back the wind-packed drifts around the cabin, checking for ice dams along the eaves, exactly where he doubled his connectors so sliding slabs of snow wouldn't rip the gutters off. This was routine winter work, not emergency triage. And that's where the social weather shifted. The same neighbors who'd once laughed about his bunker roof, who joked that he was building a tank instead of a cabin, now walked up slower, hands in pockets, voices lower. They didn't tease. They asked, "How did you size those rafters? Why didn't your wall plates spread? What did this stubborn mountain man understand about load and risk that they had shrugged off as paranoia?" Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to see what changed in their minds that morning. Because in towns like this, that quiet walk across the snow from a sagging home to a straight one is where skepticism dies and knowledge that's been buried for over a century finally gets a second hearing. They hovered. Men who joked about his bunker roof now stood in the churned path between sagging porches and the one cabin that still looked straight. Snowmelt dripped from his eaves like a metronome. Each drop was a reminder. His gamble had held. Theirs had not. His feelings were not simple. Relief came first. His family was warm, the cabin dry, the heavy stone chimney still plumb, the overbuilt roof carrying a snow load that had crushed sheds, porches, and one old bunkhouse in the hollow. But behind that relief was a dull ache. He'd walked past his neighbors' homes, rafters bowed, one roof line permanently bent like a broken rib in the rib cage of the mountains. You don't celebrate when someone else's ceiling nearly comes down on their children. And yet, under all that, there was a quiet, almost uncomfortable vindication. This was the exact winter he'd built for, the never-happens event that had just happened. The first conversation was awkward. A neighbor, who'd once laughed that his cabin looked like it was ready for artillery, cleared his throat on the porch. He didn't joke this time. He asked how many rafters Jacob had used, what spacing, what pitch. He asked, in a low voice, what he should change before next winter. That word should had never entered the talk before. It had always been, why bother? Now, let's see what Jacob built into his answer. No gloating, no, I told you so. He walked the man under the eaves, tapped the doubled rafters, explained why he'd gone deeper and closer together, why he'd chosen metal over shakes so the snow could slide when the sun finally bit. He talked about wet snow hitting 60 pounds per square foot, about drifts that don't read the code book. He shared the old alpine rule his father had drilled into him: build for the worst winter you've heard of, not the average winter you've seen. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the town was now, painfully, starting to learn? That in deep snow country, an excessive roof is just a normal roof that met reality. Over the next week, the trickle became a stream. Another neighbor brought coffee and a notebook, asking about trusses, about tying walls to rafters so sliding snow couldn't peel a roof off like a tin lid. The same contractor, who'd called his design overkill, now asked for the name of the span tables he'd used. The inspector, hat in hand, admitted that maybe the old design snow load numbers they used were optimistic. You could feel a cultural shift starting. Talk in the store wasn't just about whose porch collapsed, but about steeper pitches, heavier beams, closer spacing. Local builders debated whether code minimum had quietly become the difference between survival and catastrophe. The inspector pulled out old regional maps, re-examining what had been dismissed as freak winters. One evening, as the sun finally thinned the last hard crust on his roof, Jacob stepped back in the yard and looked up. The cabin stood easy, like a man who'd carried a heavy pack and set it down without his knees buckling. Meltwater traced clean lines down the metal, the weight that had threatened others now just a memory. He thought about all the other invisible systems in town, built to minimums instead of realities. Stoves sized for most nights, not minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Cellars dug shallow because frost never gets that deep. Even savings, even food stores, even time. How many lives, he wondered, were framed to the thinnest acceptable standard? And then a new question surfaced, one that would push him toward an even stranger idea than an overbuilt roof. If one cabin could quietly rewrite the rules for a whole valley after a single winter, what else could he build that would force the mountains to tell the truth? That question didn't stay in Jacob's head. It lands on you, right now, as directly as a snowdrift on a weak rafter. Could your roof handle the same storm that buried his neighbors' cabins to the eaves? Not in theory. in numbers. Do you actually know your local design snow load 40 pounds per square foot? 60? More? And the harder question, was your house really built to that standard or to an older, thinner line in the sand from a milder winter in some engineer's file? Most people don't know. They look up, see shingles, maybe metal, maybe a nice steep pitch, and assume the mountains will be polite. The mountains are not polite. Wet, compacted snow can push past 20 or 30 pounds per square foot. Rare, once in 50-year events can double that. That's the weight of a pickup truck spread across a small cabin roof. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his laughing neighbors did not? That the numbers matter long before the first flake falls. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to overbuild, pause and turn his paranoia into your checklist. First step, paper. Somewhere your home has a past. Building permits, original plans, truss shop drawings. Pull them from a file cabinet, an attic box, or your county's dusty archive. You're looking for a line that says, design snow load, or a note on the trusses that quietly admits what your roof was designed to carry. If you can't find it, your local building department often can. Call them. Ask what snow load your area is supposed to use today, and, this is key, what it used 20, 30, 40 years ago. That gap between past and present may be the difference between survival and catastrophe in the next record winter. Then, step back and let the cabin speak. Does the ceiling show chronic sagging between joists, not just one cracked board, but a long tired dip? Do interior doors start sticking right after every big storm, only to loosen when the melt comes? Have you fought the same ice dams along the eaves, year after year, like a slow-motion warning flare? Those are experiential clues, little confessions that your roof might already be flirting with its limits. If you live where winter is not a season, but a campaign, high mountains, lake effect belts, deep snow country, this is where caution turns professional. A structural engineer or a builder who has actually rebuilt collapsed roofs can walk your attic, read your truss layout, measure spans and spacing, and tell you whether that framing was built for a gentle climate or for the storm that hasn't arrived yet. Because the difference between Jacob's cabin and the ones that failed wasn't luck. It was the decision to ask hard questions before the sky turned white. He treated the roof the way he treated that double stone wall, as a quiet negotiation with the mountains. In the next part, we'll see exactly how he pushed that negotiation even further and why his neighbors, once again, thought he'd finally gone too far. So when Jacob started laying out that bunker roof, the reaction in the little mountain settlement was instant. Men leaned on fence posts, women paused at water barrels, and the verdict traveled faster than the wind off the ridge. He was overdoing it. Too many rafters. Too deep. Too many iron connectors. You building a cabin, Jacob, or a bridge? Now, let's see what Jacob built in terms the neighbors never calculated. A standard cabin roof in those mountains might use rough-cut rafters spaced 2 feet apart, nailed into a ridge beam with whatever spikes you had left. Jacob tightened that spacing, deepened the rafters, and tied each connection with forged straps and extra pegs. It probably added, in today's money, a few $100s of lumber and hardware and several long days of labor. Not nothing. But compared to a collapse, it was pocket change. Wet, compacted snow can press down at 20 to 30 pounds per square foot. In rare winters, the load can surge past 60. On a modest cabin, that means the roof might suddenly be carrying more than a pickup truck parked overhead. The code of the day, what little there was, assumed normal winters. Jacob wasn't building for normal. He was building for the night the mountains got angry. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors refused to price in? Before we reveal the exact technique of how he locked that roof into the double stone wall, pause and run the numbers the way Jacob did. If his overbuilding added, say, 10% to the cost of the roof, a full rebuild after a failure was closer to 50 to 100% of the entire cabin, not just new rafters, but torn out walls, ruined ceilings, and weeks of labor when you should be cutting next year's firewood. And that's the best case scenario. No one injured, no storm damage to tools or livestock, The hidden bill is worse. A partial collapse in midwinter doesn't just cost lumber, it costs nights in a neighbor's drafty loft or a boarding house in town. It means bedding soaked and frozen, food stores buried under shattered boards, tools bent, and maybe a crushed hand or broken leg. Add an insurance deductible if you're lucky enough to have a policy, and then add the thing no ledger captures, the feeling of standing in the snow, staring at a broken roof, and realizing your savings just evaporated. How do you sleep under the next storm after that? Here's the quiet irony. People will gladly pay extra for visible upgrades, the polished counter, the fancy flooring, the carved trim along the wall, because they can show those off. But ask them to invest in deeper rafters they'll never see, closer spacing hidden behind boards, thicker connectors buried in the dark, and suddenly it feels like waste. Because the return on that money is invisible when the winter is mild. It only appears on the worst night of the worst year. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is that in true frontier math, the roof and the wall are not finished choices. They are the line between a warm, intact cabin and a frozen, half-open shell. Jacob's decision to overbuild wasn't panic. It was a cold, rational wager. Pay a small, known premium now, or roll the dice on an unknown, possibly catastrophic bill later. In the next section, we'll watch that wager get called when the snow finally comes down hard, and see, beam by beam, how his excessive roof holds when others fold. That wager Jacob made with extra timber and stone wasn't just about one roof. It was about a way of looking at risk, a way of looking at the world. And here's the uncomfortable question you can't dodge once you've seen his cabin in that Montana winter. Where else are you living at code minimum and calling it good enough? On the frontier, the danger was visible. Snow on the roof, ice on the river, wind screaming through the mountains. Today, the threats are quieter, more polite. They show up as numbers on a permit, a spreadsheet, a policy document that says, this is fine, on average. But what did the stubborn mountain man understand that most of us still ignore? He understood that averages don't save you when you're the outlier. Think about a river town downstream of a levee built in 1963. The engineers sized it for the 100-year flood using rainfall records from a cooler climate, a smaller city, a different world. On paper, it still passes. The levee meets the standard. The houses behind it sell at full price. Then, a slow, warm winter packs the watershed with wet snow, spring rain comes hard, and that acceptable overtopping risk turns into 3 feet of brown water in someone's living room. For the agency, it's a 1% event. For that family, it's a 100%. Or look inside your own walls. That breaker panel in the basement was sized for the load profile of the year it was installed. A fridge, a range, a few outlets, not induction cooktops, EV chargers, always-on electronics. The wiring is legal, the wall never complains. Until one cold night, every space heater is running, the dryer is on, and a tired conductor behind the drywall is doing quiet math it can't win. Financially, it's the same cold equation. Emergency funds that should cover 3 months of expenses were designed for a world where rent, heat, and food didn't jump 30% in a decade. On the spreadsheet, that buffer looks responsible. In a real crisis, with a job loss and a medical bill in the same winter, you discover you built to the wrong storm. Institutions have to think in terms of populations, probabilities, and acceptable failure rates. They design cabins for the average winter, levees for the average river, policies for the average citizen. But you don't live as an average. You live as one. When the beam cracks or the bank balance hits zero, the statistics vanish. The failure rate for you is not 0.3%. It is total. So pause the story for a moment. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used to overbuild that roof, pull the camera back on your own life. Where are your critical roofs? The structural ones, yes, foundations, walls, electrical, the way your cabin handles heat and cold, but also the invisible ones, your income, your savings, your health, the single server your business runs on, the one car your family depends on to cross those mountains when the snow comes. You don't need to turn everything into a bunker. Jacob didn't pour a fortress out of stone. He chose one or two failure points where a modest overbuild would mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Maybe for you it's upgrading that undersized panel before adding one more hydro appliance. Maybe it's one extra month of expenses and cash, or a backup heat source that doesn't depend on a fragile grid. Maybe it's a steeper roof pitch instead of the flat, trendy line the neighbors admire right up until the first record storm. Now, let's see what Jacob built as a philosophy. He refused to outsource his safety to the thinnest acceptable margin. The code was a floor, not a finish line. That mindset is the real thermal mass here, the knowledge that's been buried for over a century under layers of good enough. In the next section, we're going back to that cabin, back under that ridiculous roof, and we'll watch what happens when the snow load climbs past what the table said would ever arrive, and the averages finally break. Most people watching this are not about to peel their cabin back to bare rafters and rebuild from scratch. You have a roof. It's there. It passed inspection. And yet, in the back of your mind, you've seen the winters getting heavier, and you're wondering, quietly, if good enough is really enough when the mountains decide to test it. Jacob wondered the same thing. But instead of waiting for the next record-breaking storm, he treated his roof the way he treated that double stone wall, as a system he could methodically upgrade, not with a dramatic teardown, but with targeted, strategic reinforcements. That's where most people miss the real opportunity. They think resilience means starting over. It doesn't. It means starting smart. Before we reveal the exact technique he used on that ridiculous roof, look at what you can do with the bones you already have. In mini cabins, the quickest wins are invisible: bracing, connectors, and weak spot surgery. Those skinny metal ties the builder sprinkled in to satisfy code, they're the floor, not the finish line. Upgrading to heavier hurricane clips, adding structural screws where there were only nails, and tying rafters more firmly into the top plates can radically change how that roof behaves when thousands of pounds of wet snow settle in overnight. Now, let's see what Jacob built, at least in principle. He knew snow doesn't load a roof evenly. It drifts into valleys. It stacks on low-slope sections. It piles deep over wide open spans, like the classic over-garage bonus room where the framing was often squeezed to save money. Those are the ambush points. Reinforcing just those zones, sistering rafters, adding short posts down to bearing walls, or inserting a supplemental beam under a sagging span, can turn a known failure line into a quiet non-event. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that many modern builders ignore? That one carefully placed beam can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. In the attic, the upgrades get even more direct. Accessible framing is an invitation. Adding collar ties higher in the roof to keep rafters from spreading, rafter ties lower to keep walls from bowing, and diagonal bracing to stop that subtle racking motion all increase capacity. But here's the crucial part. Under professional guidance, this isn't random lumber nailed wherever you can reach. This is calculated geometry using an engineer or experienced framer to turn your attic from a hollow triangle into a truss that actually moves loads into the walls and down into the ground. Then there's the snow itself. Jacob watched how it moved, how it slid, how it froze. Metal roofs without control can shed a roof avalanche that rips gutters off and buries doors. Strategic snow guards break that sheet into manageable pieces. Better insulation at the ceiling plane and real ventilation under the roof deck keep heat where it belongs, reducing ice dams that pry shingles up and trap meltwater. And when the numbers on the weather report start hinting at record weight, a plan for safe, controlled snow removal, anchors, harness, roof rake, clear ground paths turns panic into routine. The neighbors laughed at Jacob's bunker roof because they only saw the thickness, not the method. He wasn't reacting to one scary winter. He was building a sequence. Identify weak link, reinforce, then move to the next. That's knowledge that's been buried for over a century under the myth that if the inspector signed off, you're done. But what happens when the storm that never happens finally rolls over the ridge and the snow doesn't stop at the design tables? In the next segment, you'll see how those quiet upgrades behave when the roof next door starts to groan and then fails. And here's the uncomfortable twist. The roof that fails and the roof that survives can both have passed inspection the same week. Most builders in those mountains weren't villains. They were trying to get families under a warm roof before winter, not secretly plotting collapses. Inspectors weren't twirling mustaches in the snow. They were checking spans, nail patterns, truss stamps, then racing to the next cabin. The system quietly rewarded one thing above all: meet the minimums, move on, don't slow the machine. Overbuilding? That was extra, not required. Now, let's see what Jacob built in principle, not just in logs and stone, but in mindset. He was pushing past the culture of good enough on paper. Most modern construction leans the other way. Truss packages arrive with glossy diagrams and big bold words about efficiency, fast installation, and cost savings. The brochures show perfect blue skies over perfect roofs. They rarely show 3 feet of wet, compacted snow, 60 pounds per square foot pressing down, while the wind drives drifts into dangerous pockets. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the marketing team still gloss over? That the rare, once-in-50-year winter is the real exam, but the pamphlets emphasize how light the system is, how it optimizes material use, how it makes the cabin cheaper today. Long-term resilience under that brutal, record-breaking cold? That ends up in a footnote, if it appears at all. Behind the scenes, another quiet assumption creeps in. If a roof does fail in that freak storm, well, that's what insurance is for, right? Some developers and manufacturers will never say this on camera, but the math is simple. It's easier to externalize the risk than to design it out. If one cabin in 100 has a catastrophic failure in a big winter, the insurer and the homeowner carry the pain. The builder still met code. The truss package still matched the tables. And unless you, standing there in the cold, explicitly ask about design snow loads, safety margins, and what happens when the drifts pile higher than the drawings, the default path is almost always the same. Use the lightest truss that passes. Use the thinnest sheathing that passes. Use connectors that pass. You're good. It meets code. On paper, it's safe. Under that once-in-a-lifetime storm, that difference between survival and catastrophe can suddenly appear. Jacob, without modern codes, accidentally behaved like the client the industry rarely advertises, but secretly respects. He asked in his own way the questions most people never voice. How much weight will this wall really carry? What happens when the fire goes out and the wind screams all night? Where are the weak links? Before we reveal the exact technique he used on that roof, understand this. The system will not volunteer those answers. You have to drag them into the light. In the next segment, we'll walk through the specific overbuild choices that turned one too-heavy roof into the only quiet, unbroken line in a valley of sagging rafters. So let's drag one more thing into the light. Not Jacob's roof. Yours. Right now, wherever you are watching this from, your cabin, your house, that little A-frame you dream about in the mountains, it already has a number hanging over it, a snow number, a limit. The question is, do you actually know what it is? There's a map for your roof, several, in fact. Ground snow load, design snow load. These are not secret codes for engineers in distant offices. You can pull them up, state or national snow load maps online, local building department websites. Or if you live where the winters bite hard, one phone call to the building desk at your town or county. What's the design snow load for my area? That's it. That's the sentence. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that most of his neighbors never bothered to ask? He knew the numbers before the snow came. He knew what his walls and roof were built to carry, long before the first white sheet settled on the ridge. So here's your challenge. When this video ends, look up your number. Then, don't stop there. Put it next to reality. Pull up weather archives. Search that record winter your grandparents still talk about, the January when school was closed for a week. The storm where the supermarket roof failed 2 towns over. News reports will often mention record snowfall in inches. Meteorological summaries sometimes convert that to pounds per square foot. Has your area already seen storms that match or quietly exceed what your roof was supposedly designed for? Now, let's see what Jacob built in you. Curiosity or complacency? Drop what you find in the comments, your region, your design, snow load, and the heaviest winter you remember or can document. North Idaho, 70 PSF, 2017, roof shoveling nightmare. Central Massachusetts, 40 PSF, 2015, ice crust winter. Let's turn that comment section into a crowdsourced risk map the codebooks never expected. You will see patterns. High mountains with heavy design loads, but roofs that still failed in freak. Wet storms. Mild regions with laughably low numbers that have already been brushed by once-in-50-year events. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century in engineering tables suddenly becomes very personal when you realize the snow over your head might weigh more than a pickup truck. And if your comparison leaves your stomach a little tight, good. That tension is the difference between survival and catastrophe. Use it. Take those numbers to a qualified structural engineer, an experienced builder, the person who actually understands the bones of your house. Ask calmly, what does my roof really carry? What are my options to strengthen it before the next big winter? Jacob's story did not start with heroics. It started with questions and arithmetic. Your first step is even smaller. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to overbuild that too heavy roof, make sure you know, to the pound, what yours was ever meant to hold. That arithmetic is the quiet villain in this story. On paper, the whole town was fine. The cabins met the local code. The inspectors were satisfied. The neighbors were comfortable with good enough rafters and just thick enough sheathing. Then, one winter, the mountains stopped caring about paperwork. Storm after storm stacked on the roofs. Powder turned to wet, compacted slabs. Drifts curled over ridges like frozen waves. And without a word, physics started grading everyone's assumptions at once. Snow load is not an abstract number at a table. It's weight. Real, crushing weight. 20, 30, 60 pounds, pressing on every square foot of roof when storms stall, when thaw and refreeze weld the layers together, when wind piles it higher on one side than the other. A flat garage roof can suddenly be carrying more than a parking lot of pickup trucks. A pretty cabin with a shallow pitch can be holding a small stone quarry above your head. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors refused to see? That the design load is not a promise. It's a bet placed on the past. Codes look backward at history. The mountains throw the next hand from the future. When the once-in-50-year winter shows up in year 23, your roof doesn't get to negotiate. It either carries the weight or it folds. Here's the uncomfortable part. It is hard to spend money on a danger you have never personally watched play out. If you've never heard a truss crack in the night or seen a ridge sag under wet March snow, extra strength feels wasteful. That's why the neighbors laughed at Jacob's bunker roof. That's why people roll their eyes at thicker beams, deeper rafters, closer spacing, until the snow piles up. Stories like this are how you and I borrow someone else's wake-up call without paying the full price. His victory was never about fear. He didn't build a fortress because he was terrified of winter. He built a stronger roof out of respect. Respect for the cold, for the mountains, for the old tales of barns flattened in freak storms. Respect for the simple fact that rare events do not stay rare. Everywhere, forever, they arrive. Somewhere. Someday. And when they do, the difference between survival and catastrophe is decided years earlier in quiet choices about dimensions and fasteners that no one claps for. Now, let's see what Jacob built in principle, because this lesson reaches far beyond a cabin roof. The pattern is the same in your finances, in your backup heat, in any system where failure is far more expensive than a little overbuilding. You can chase minimums, or you can choose a margin. One path trusts that tomorrow will look like yesterday. The other quietly assumes that one winter, it won't. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is simple here. When the cost of collapse is everything, too strong is often just on time. So now, look ahead with him. Not to last winter, to the next one. Maybe it's 3 years out, a wet Pacific system slamming into cold continental air over these same mountains. Maybe it's this season, a once-in-50-year dump that doesn't care what the codebook said was good enough. The question is simple. When that weight settles on your roof, do you want a minimum or a margin, because this is where the frontier meets your driveway. Jacob's cabin had stone in the walls. Our protagonist has snow on the roof. Different material, same lesson. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors kept laughing off? That when the cold turns serious, the line between overbuilt and on time can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. So here's your short, sharp checklist before the next storm rolls over the ridge. First, know your design snow load. Not a guess. Not, it's always been fine. Real numbers. Wet, compacted snow can run 20 to 30 pounds per square foot in a normal bad winter. Freak events can drive that past 60 FCF. Your county, your elevation, your microclimate on that hill or in that valley all change what your roof is truly asked to carry. Second, understand your roof's actual capacity. Not what the realtor said, what the framing, spacing, and connections can really take. Are those rafters shallow and widely spaced, or are they deeper, closer, and properly tied into the walls? Is that low-pitch addition a quiet failure point hiding beside a steeper main cabin roof? Before we reveal the exact technique in future episodes, this is the mindset. You're not living under a mystery. You're living under math. Third, think about targeted overbuild where it matters most. Ridge lines where drifting piles up. Valleys between roofs where sliding slabs land like slow avalanches. A few stronger trusses, better connectors, that excessive beam the inspector smirked at. In snow country, those details are not decoration, they are quiet insurance. If you want more stories like this, real cabins, real storms, real numbers, hit subscribe. This channel is for deep dive tales where engineering, history, and preparedness all share the same fire. Now, let's see what Jacob built becomes now. Let's see what you're living under. We're going to look at hidden structural and systemic risks most people never think about until the night the lights go out. Share this with a friend who jokes that their roof has made it this far. With the family in serious snow country whose garage already sagged last winter. This isn't just interesting trivia. It's knowledge that's been buried for over a century. And it can keep a cabin warm, a roof standing, and a family out of the cold. Out there, our protagonist sits under his heavy, ridiculous roof. The wind picks up. The snow taps, then piles, then presses down in silence. Inside, the lights stay on. The house stays warm. The neighbors' comments don't matter anymore. The only question left is this. When the next big winter leans on your roof, do you want to be the one laughing at overbuilds or the one everyone runs to when the first rafters crack? Because the storm is coming. And in the next episode, we're going to show you where most people never even think to look.